Good afternoon and welcome to a new event organized by the Observatorio de la Lengua Española y las Culturas Hispánicas en los Estados Unidos. We have already held several lectures, seminars, workshops in the past few years in collaboration with Harvard Professor María Luisa Parra from the Department of Romance, Languages and Literatures within the project that she coordinates, RLL's initiative on teaching Spanish as a heritage language, which is co-sponsored by the Observatorio. This time, the session is part of a new lecture series that the language program of RLL organizes on topics related to language teaching. The topic selected for this fall is engagement, and we are very pleased to be able to contribute to that interesting and useful series with one of the distinguished professors that Dr. Parra always proposes for her projects with us, Professor Lourdes Ortega from Georgetown University, whom it is an honor to welcome to this research center of the Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University, and who will be introduced by Professor Parra. So welcome, Lourdes. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today. And thank you, María Luisa. It is always a pleasure to collaborate with you. And you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Marta. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. As Marta mentioned, this session is part of the lecture series on engagement with languages and cultures organized by my colleague, Dr. Nicole Mills, and myself, and hosted by the Observatorio Cervantes and the RLL's initiative on teaching Spanish as a heritage language. So thank you, Marta and Observatorio, for your continued support to these projects related to the teaching of Spanish. And this afternoon, it is my true pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Lourdes Ortega. She's linguistics professor in the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown University and faculty director of Georgetown University's initiative on multilingual studies. Dr. Ortega investigates how people learn new languages, particularly in higher education settings. This interest comes from her own upbringing and language learning experiences through several countries in Europe, which has shaped her professional identities as an educator and researcher. She's committed to investigating what it means to become bilingual or multilingual later in life and across elite and marginalized contexts for language learning. In her work, she seeks to support harmonious bilingualism and the well-being of all multilinguals. Her work includes important topics and reflections around the meaning and social relevance of doing research on bilingualism. To quote the title of one of her articles, she's interested in understanding for what and for whom is our research. She's a key voice for the bilingual and social justice turn in the field of second language acquisition. Her academic work is vast and has been published around the world. She has published widely in journals such as Calico, World Englishes, Modern Language Journal, Language Learning, and Studies in Second Language Acquisition. She's the author of the bestseller graduate level textbook, Understanding Second Language Acquisition by Routledge 2009, translated into Mandarin in 2016. Her latest book is the Cambridge Handbook on Bilingualism, co-edited with Child Bilingualism Research and Nick de Hoover. She's the general editor of Language Learning and the president-elect of the American Association for Applied Linguistics. So as you can see, we have an incredible speaker this afternoon. Thank you so much, Lourdes, for being here with us this afternoon.
Thank you so much, María Luisa, for this introduction. I'm honored to be here, and I love the highlights of my research, the substance of the research that I try to do. And many of the other things you said, they show how little of a life I have, except for work. But let me try to share the screen now. And we can start as soon. Oh. Let me, oh, all right, that didn't work. Let me try again. Every time we think we are okay with the technology, then we are not. All right, I need to open my PowerPoint again because I lost it. Okay. And here it is. All right. Once again, let's try. And now share screen and share presenter mode. Okay, great. So thank you very much again. And I am so pleased to be here. I wish it could be in person, but at least we're all connected online through the wonderful technology that we have discovered since the pandemic. And I'm very grateful to María Luisa Parra Velasco and to Marta for inviting me, Marta Mateo, for inviting me to give this talk, and also Victoria, Lori, Whitney, and Joseph Rager have been very, very helpful setting up everything. Let me start right away by talking first about student engagement and defining it. We have a very well-known researcher of student engagement, Seymour Papert, and he's really the founder of the constructionist movement in education, and he defined engagement as hard fun. So he says students are eager to engage in challenging tasks under the right conditions. We also have the very famous concept of flow, engagement as flow, as a state of intense concentration in interesting and enjoyable tasks. So this idea of interest and enjoyment is going to be very important when talking about student engagement. And we also have a definition of engagement as agentive by John Marshall Reeve in Australia. And he defines engagement as the extent to which students become actively involved or not in teacher-provided learning opportunities, but in addition, whether they try to enhance the conditions under which they learn by making suggestions, offering input, and communicating preferences. So that's the agentive part of the engagement. And a researcher at the University of Southern California, Gail Sinatra, defines engagement as composed of 4 states. The interest and enjoyment part refers to affective states that are associated with engagement. We also have visible engagement with tasks, where we see behavioral states like being bodily active, raising your hand, speaking, etc. Concentration is another dimension of engagement when we cognitively are immersed in the task and the learning. And also, finally, future actions, which goes to agentive states, ways in which students direct their own learning for the future as well. And so student engagement, as you see, is very multi-dimensional. There is a meta-analysis that connects student engagement with academic achievement, and it's actually quite large, 69 studies of learning by students in grades 1 through 12. And they found a robust, if medium-sized, correlation between student engagement and academic achievement. These, if considered separately for the behavioral engagement, the cognitive engagement, and the emotional engagement, they were similar, but behavioral seems to be, when a study measures behavioral engagement, it really finds a good resonance with academic achievement. And in this meta-analysis, no studies looked at agentive engagement. But we can see that engagement is very important in students because it really helps to boost academic achievement. So given that, my message today is going to be that for students to want to engage affectively, behaviorally, cognitively, agentively with Spanish, they need to feel that their learning connects to the rest of their lives, and this directly refers to the affective states of engagement. They need to feel proud of who they are in all their languages, in their entire linguistic repertoire. And I will talk about linguistic confidence, multilingual view of success, ideologies, and agency under this principle of engagement. And finally, for students to want to engage with Spanish, they will need to feel that they have a say over their learning. And this has to do with autonomy and agentive engagement. So let me start with the first point, the need to connect with their lives. The learning has to connect with their lives for students to be engaged in our teaching, in what we have to offer to them. There are two approaches to student engagement that really rely on life relevance, on making that connection between what is learned and the life of students. And they are task-based language teaching and critical language awareness. So let me start briefly with TBLT, and then I will spend more time with critical language awareness. There are several researchers of Spanish learning and teaching who all come from Georgetown, my own university. They are alumni from the Spanish and Portuguese department, but many of them also took classes with me at some point. And they have promoted the idea of task-based language teaching applied to Spanish in the field. And some of the features of TBLT that are very important for fostering engagement and have a good likelihood of fostering engagement are that TBLT should start with needs analysis. Therefore, we have by force to consider the lives of students, their needs, their wants, their desires, in order to design then a good task-based language teaching program for them. With TBLT, everything is about the content of those tasks. So that content gives us an opportunity to connect with our lives. Most tasks are typically based on collaboration among peers, and that in itself also supports engagement. And there is a great deal of negotiation that can go on between the teacher and the students, among the students, what desired outcomes a task can have, linguistic, but also content-wise. And so this negotiation gives agentivity and agency to students, and again, is a good way of fostering engagement. I don't know how many of you know this, but Laura Gurzinski-Weiss at the University of Indiana has created a language learning bank of tasks. And many of them are for Spanish, but also for other languages. So this is a very useful resource for those of you wanting to explore more about tasks and possibilities for the classroom. There is also a very good book that appeared in 2016, a practical guide to integrating technology into task-based language teaching, because TBLT builds upon technology and the engagement that technology provides very heavily. And Marta Gonzalez Lloret at the University of Hawaii wrote this book. It's very short, very well designed, and very practical, as the title says, for teachers. But let me then spend more time with the critical language awareness, because this is a movement that really has taken off tremendously in the field of Spanish language teaching and learning, and it is very, very relevant to the US, to teaching Spanish in the US. We have two leaders of critical language awareness, Sarah Baudry and Sergio Loza, and they have published a book very recently, I think it was this year, on heritage language teaching and a critical language awareness approach to teaching heritage students. So they define CLA as the approach that teaches learners explicitly about language ideologies and instill agency to correct such social wrongs by prioritizing and centering learners' social and linguistic experiences in the classroom. So what are some of the ideal designs for critical language awareness? We can do sociolinguistic assignments in the classroom. This has been done very well by Damián Vergara Wilson, one of the leaders of critical language awareness, with her colleague Marisol Marcin. And they have tried it out in mixed heritage and second language classrooms. So for example, you could give an assignment where students do a sociolinguistic interview, and they go out and they show a picture of a turkey to speakers in the Southwest, to community speakers, and then they elicit all the many terms that one can have for the pavo or turkey in the Spanish world and in the US context for Spanish. And here are some quotes from students benefiting from these sociolinguistic interviews and this approach. Terry, who was a heritage language student in New York, said, en este curso pensé que aprendería sobre los aspectos negativos del Spanglish y cómo afecta la percepción de las personas de quienes hablan Spanglish. En realidad lo que aprendí fue mucho más de lo que esperaba. Aprendí que el Spanglish no es un idioma mixto que carece de la falta de comprensión o conocimiento de cualquiera de los dos idiomas, sino es un recurso que muchos hablantes utilizan para comunicarse mejor. Aprendí cómo la lengua afecta la identidad y cómo el Spanglish es algo utilizado en los Estados Unidos. And another student, this one, a foreign, so-called foreign language or second language student from New Mexico, says, sí leímos muchos artículos sobre el Spanglish y muchas perspectivas sobre las que no había pensado. Por ejemplo, de cuando Donald Trump dijo, he's bad hombre. Y creo que dijo y ese tipo de tonterías como examinándolos de este punto de vista analítico, ¿no? ¿Por qué está diciendo eso? ¿Por qué está empleando como despectivamente el Spanglish? So you see that the two students, given their backgrounds and their connections to their lives, are getting different things from the approach in this course. Linguistic landscape assignments are also becoming very popular, and Idoia Elola and Josh Prada have a study explaining how they used it. And here's, for example, a linguistic landscape photo from the study, and they noticed that students were very aware and they self-discovered translanguaging through the linguistic landscape photos that they took. So one of the students said, algunas señales tienen español e inglés mezclados, pero no en forma de traducciones. Diferentes ideas son diferentes lenguas porque la gente puede leer los dos idiomas. Like in this picture, we have four for $10, a little drawing of a boxer, and then boxer de hombre. There is no real translation. It's a blend. It's a translanguaged occasion, right? And María Luisa Parra, she has a very, very good book that came out last year, How to Teach Español a la Juventud Latina en Estados Unidos. And in her work for many years now, she has experimented with working with art and poems in class to raise critical language awareness in the students she works with. And here's, for example, a quote from one of her studies earlier in 2013, where a heritage Mexican-American student says, me introdujo a un artista de reggaetón de la República Dominicana y a un rapero de El Salvador. El curso le introdujo. En particular, me interesó la música del rapero de El Salvador. La letra de una de sus canciones hablaba de la situación económica de su comunidad, de la violencia que los rodea y en general de muchos de los problemas socioeconómicos que se encuentran en Latinoamérica. Entonces, she is connecting social issues with her own life and her own preference for rap, for reggaeton and other kinds of music that she likes. And another student, Riley, who is the granddaughter of a Chicano family, says, me siento muy agradecida de haber conocido a tradiciones de otras culturas y estudiantes mientras exploraba la mía. Gracias a esta clase me he conectado más con mis raíces chicanas. And as you see then, connecting our materials and our content critically with language awareness and with the lives of students doesn't mean that they don't become interested in other people's lives and other realities, but they need to see a relevance to their own life as well. We also have service courses, and many of you may be teaching them actually, because they are very popular these days. There's a study by Rachel Schultz-Stack where she chronicles how she did a service course for interpretation in a clinic. And the students were 3 heritage language and 3 foreign language students. They had very diverse Spanish and health experiences, and they all volunteered as interpreters in the clinic. And one of the main things they learned was how to start understanding the role of interpreters as advocates for the patients, and how to do more than just interpretation or translation by providing assistance to them as clarifiers of meaning and cultural brokers. So in all of these efforts with critical language awareness, there is a big focus on heritage speakers, although it is not an exclusive focus. So some of the studies that I was citing students from, they were mixed classes, but many of the critical language awareness efforts have been directed particularly to heritage speakers. So we have great scholars, and I will just kind of flash slides now just to acknowledge how much work there has been in the field of heritage language education by Kim Topolsky and Diego Pascual y Cabo and Julio Torres, with a very nice book in Spanish, published also this year, Aproximaciones al estudio del español como lengua de herencia. We have Jenny Lehman and Janet Fuller, also a great book, also in Spanish, published last year, Hablar Español en Estados Unidos, la sociopolítica del lenguaje. Damián Vergara Wilson, who I already mentioned, has created an entire program for heritage speakers in New Mexico. Sergio Loza is doing the same thing at the University of Oregon. Claudia Olguín Mendoza is doing it in California. And Jenny Lehman and Ellen Serafini are doing it also at George Mason University here. They are my neighbors. But there is a little bit of an assumption sometimes that heritage students need their own classes because if they are mixed classes, they're going to be less engaged. And so a study in 2020 directly addressed that. Josh Prada, Paula Guerrero Rodriguez, and Diego Cabal, Diego Pascual y Cabo, they were studying this issue, are mixed classes less engaging for heritage language students? And what they found was interesting. They did say that heritage students experience more enjoyment in the heritage language classroom than in the L2 classroom. So, for example, the Spanish heritage student in the study said, I have never really taken a Spanish class that was about me. But in this class, we spoke about Cuba and Mexico, but there are people in class that come from Cuba and Mexico, or their parents come from there. It's more like we were talking about ourselves rather than about other countries. That was nice. When we spoke about Puerto Rico, I could talk about my grandma because she's from Puerto Rico, and I could talk about myself as Puerto Rican. So more relevance to their lives and more engagement and enjoyment. However, I would like to question a little bit whether that finding should lead us to think that we must always create heritage language classes only, or it just should show us that we must design more engaged classes. So let me then move to explaining a little bit why in my title I said foreign heritage and multilingual engagement. I want to talk about identities and emotions of different groups of students that we label as foreign or second language students, heritage students, and I want to propose that we should be thinking of all of them as multilingual students. So the labels that we have, they sort of assume that different groups of students, different profiles of students have different wants, different self-perceptions, and therefore different engagements. And we do tend to classify things dichotomously in language teaching, in second language acquisition as well. But I think that self-chosen identities are, of course, very important. So self-chosen labels are important. At the same time, though, I think that we need to recognize that there is great heterogeneity within each label. So we often hear about how heterogeneous the outcomes of Spanish learning are for heritage language students, how different their Spanishes can be, or how, some can be so advanced, but some can be not so advanced. However, we do not recognize appropriately, I think, that their profiles themselves are very heterogeneous. So this is what Alberto Agatti has done in a study with a colleague, O'Neill. They studied heritage speakers in the New York City area. 77 of them were Spanish. And when they report on who they are, these heritage speakers, they say they come from 16 different originary countries. 2/3 of them are born in the United States. A third is born outside of the United States with an mean arrival of 10 years old. 3/4 of the mothers and 62+ of the parents have at least high school as an education. And 1/4 of mothers and fathers have completed college. So very different kinds of educational profiles in the family. And 38 of those 77 heritage speakers have received formal Spanish instruction in the US prior to high school. So with so many dual language programs, etc., we're beginning to see more heritage students who actually have also received formal Spanish instruction before they come to high school or to college. So this inevitably means that the profiles, the kinds of students that we call heritage, are not just all the same just because we label them as being the same. And so I want to ask also, what about personal relevance and emotions? We're talking back to the dimension of affective states, interest and enjoyment in engagement. So here's a study by Megan Driver, who is now at Michigan State University, and she studied 121 Spanish learners. She gave them 3 texts that were laden with emotions. One was sort of neutral about bilingual programs in the United States. The other one was very negative, anti-immigration. It was a position paper that was very anti-immigration. And the third text was positive. It was about the contributions of the Latinx community in the United States. And what she wanted to do is see whether they would learn better or worse these pseudo words that she put into the texts, depending on what the emotions of the text overall were and what the emotions of the words themselves were. So again, neutral words, negative words, and positive words. She recruited her students from, I forget, like 10 different universities on the East Coast, private and public, and she ended up with 64 heritage learners and 57 foreign language learners. So she said, what she found is that they had similar emotional reactions to the texts, but the sources or the reasons for their emotional reactions were different. So a heritage learner of Spanish would say things like, I am frustrated with immigrants being considered a drain to this country. I see how it affects me and my family on a daily basis. And a foreign learner of Spanish would also express similar emotions, anger, frustration, but for different reasons. This student said, the first negative text made me extremely angry because I have family members who think that way about illegal immigrants, especially with recent events regarding ICE and the camps immigrants are being put into. The mindset behind that reading made me frustrated. So different reasons, similar emotions. And so when she looked at the findings, she also found that everyone patterned in the same way, regardless of whether they were foreign or heritage. 3 main findings. First, a reading's connection to biographical and personal memories makes it more likely to arouse an emotional response. So this is the engagement thing, right? The second finding was that the negative and the neutral texts were better for learning the vocabulary than the positive texts, maybe because they elicited mixed emotions and deeper processing. But negative and neutral topics were better for vocabulary language learning. And finally, the neutral words were the ones that were recalled more successfully. So she also got a surprise. Under the so-called foreign students, she found out that 30% of them were heritage or native of another language, not of Spanish, but of another language. Lots of different languages in the sample. And so again, they had the same kinds of reactions and emotions, and they patterned in their sources for their emotions with the heritage speakers of Spanish. So the heritageness was making them feel in similar ways, but also for similar reasons with the heritage Spanish speakers. So this so-called foreign language learner, who was a heritage of Albanian, he said, the third article, which dealt with language acquisition and national sentiments towards bilingualism, relates directly to my life, as I am a first-generation American citizen. My entire family is bilingual and supports the prospect of being able to speak more than one language. Members of my family and I have all experienced moments of nativism in the United States. Thus, I had quite a bit of personal investment in the material I was reading. So engagement, connection to personal life, not just because of the Spanish heritage, but being a heritage speaker in the US. And so maybe we shouldn't just think of heritage and foreign language learners. Yes, those labels can be useful. They are important to consider. But what about also thinking of a multilingual continuum for our students? And this is again with what Beatriz Lado and José del Valle found in another study of critical language awareness. They had no heritage students in their samples, but they had very multilingual students, and many of them heritage speakers of other languages. And one of these students says, I found the readings enlightening as it has to do with my daily life as a New Yorker. So once again, engagement is connecting with one's own life. But many language learners of languages are indeed moved by the desire to come closer to the community that they live in, the communities that are in their lives, and they could be linguistically authentic self-communities or linguistically authentic other communities, and the engagement appears in both cases. So in this world and age, we need to go beyond binaries. We also have a very large number of students of Spanish all over the world in countries like China and Korea and Japan, believe it or not. And so it's very important to consider that there is a multilingual continuum that we can leverage when we think of critical language awareness and student engagement in our pedagogy. So let's think of the heterogeneity within each label, and let's make our multilingualism in our classrooms more visible in our pedagogy. Let me move on to feeling proud of who students are in all their languages and talk about linguistic confidence, a multilingual view of success, and ideologies and agencies. Let's talk about language insecurity. Have you ever noticed how much linguistic insecurity we have in ourselves as teachers and in our students and our heritage students especially? Grosjean, who is a bilingualism researcher, puts it very well in this quote. Many bilinguals have a tendency to evaluate their language competencies as inadequate. Some criticize their mastery of language skills. Others strive their hardest to reach monolingual norms. Others still hide their knowledge of their weaker language. And most simply do not perceive themselves as being bilingual, even though they use 2 or more languages regularly. That is linguistic insecurity. It's a vexing problem because what is happening is bilinguals and their teachers judging their linguistic competence in any of their languages with a monolingual native yardstick. And it's a yardstick that is monolingual, is native, is educated, and is white Spanish speaking kind of idealization. So this is a puzzle. This is something that if we cannot dismantle, we will never be able to truly engage students. We must combat at all costs this idea that learning a language, learning Spanish or any other language, is like a ladder towards native speaker perfection. And by native speaker perfection, we also have a monolingual ideal, a native educated and white ideal. We know that this linguistic insecurity is truly, truly acute for heritage language students. They have their home language, they have the societal language, and actually we treat them as if they only had one of those languages for when we are with them, right? So the Spanish teachers care about the home language and the Spanish of the heritage speakers, and then ESL teachers care about the same speakers, English, because they are also called 1.5 generation speakers. And so these students oftentimes participate in different contexts educationally where they're always being criticized for all of their languages, the Spanish, the English. And so this can only result in huge insecurity. Teachers can instill, with our messages, we can instill truly worrisome linguistic insecurity. So in a study by Linda Hartlau, she had a participant, a student, Easy, who was in high school taking Spanish 3, and Easy talked about the teacher in this way. She says, the teacher didn't like the way we talked. We have to speak international Spanish. She's like, no, you don't say it like that. That's not the right way. That's how you say it, the word where you're from, but in international Spanish, you say it this way. So this invented notion of international Spanish as something that is global, lingua franca Spanish, but that the heritage speakers need to learn because they don't own. Right? Sergio Loza, in an early study with 6 teachers, some of whom were heritage speakers, quotes this teacher of heritage background who says, ok, yo conozco a muchos estudiantes que han estudiado el español de manera muy formal, que han perdido la conexión con su familia porque ya no hablan igual que su familia, si me entiendes. So this is what Easy is saying, that the teacher wants her to speak international Spanish and forget about the Spanish that she actually speaks at home and with her community and her family. And in another study, we have a very clear example of linguistic insecurity. Linda, in her mid-30s, is a 3rd-generation Mexican American, and she's explaining to the researcher why she decided to take Spanish classes at her age. And she says, I consider myself semi-fluent because I can understand it, I can speak it, I can write it, but some of the words sometimes may be used from my Tex-Mex vocabulary versus the real Spanish that we should use. In communicating with someone who knows the proper language, you know, you can get a smirk from them. And I felt like, you know, it was important that I learned what the correct words were for what I considered Tex-Mex, because when you get that puzzled look, it kind of makes you feel silly. Like, oh my goodness, I've said something that they don't understand. That means that was Tex-Mex. So there's so much internalized linguistic deficit and linguistic insecurity here, right? Sanchez Munoz also gives us a very similar quotes in her study, people feeling ashamed going back to visit family in the originary countries and feeling ashamed of their Spanish, and feeling ashamed when translating for family members. And she basically in her study, she just says, our heritage language education seems to be a case of designing something for the healing and to do damage control with heritage speakers. But I would argue that linguistic insecurity is not just a property of the heritage experience. It is also something that plagues all students. And so it's because all bilinguals and multilinguals are experiencing linguicism and native speakerism. They're being positioned by others as a novice, a foreigner, an outside member, or a not capable speaker. They're being told that their language is not good enough yet. You need to study more, you need to improve more, you're not good enough yet. And so in a study that I did many years ago, one of the students, for example, seemed to have a lot of linguistic insecurities, telling me, I always go back and think about the errors that I make, almost to the point where I don't want to say anything if it's going to be wrong. Although I think I've gotten past that problem, you see, otherwise you can't say anything. But yeah, I want it to be perfect. I'm always trying to get it 100% perfect. I'm never happy with just sort of less. So the student is paralyzed, prefers not to say anything if it's going to be wrong than to say something, even if it would be interesting and wrong. And Susana Perez Castillejo has a study in language testing, which is a very high-powered journal with lots of numbers. And she was able to connect anxiety and proficiency with fluency. And so in her study, basically, she's saying the more anxious a student is, the longer the pauses at the end of sentences they do. And the less anxious a student is, the higher proficiency they tend to have. And anxiety itself explains the majority of the variance that we see in fluency. So definitely linguistic insecurity is going to silence people. Yeah. How do we teach Spanish while supporting our students to be empowered multilinguals? Well, surely I've talked about two kinds of pedagogies that can help, but if we don't get our ideology straight as teachers and with our students, I don't think we can make progress. So let me talk about ideologies and agency a little bit faster so that we can finish in time for interaction and questions. What does it mean to be a competent language user? What's success and what's failure? And who is to tell? Does the family member have the right to tell? Does the teacher have the right to tell? Does the student have the right to tell? Some students are resilient to linguicism and native speakerism, and this always puzzles me. No matter how negative the experience is, some students are able to build resilience and reject the deficit that the perception of deficit that they receive. So, for example, this 17-year-old high school student in the United States, Carmen, she says, my Spanish is getting a little bit bad, but I still try to have it. I still speak Spanish. Sometimes I speak Spanglish. It's just like when I don't know a Spanish word, I'll say it in English. And if I don't know it in English, I'll say it in Spanish. It's just like, it's like an everyday thing. I think it's something that I'm going to use like every day. Yeah, I use it. I translate for my mom or my grandma, and just here in school too. I like being bilingual. So she just really doesn't suffer from linguistic insecurity. Izzy, going back to the study, when she told her mom what the teacher had said about international Spanish, she says that the mom says, she's just making you all dumber. And that her family in Mexico was not going to understand if she was going to talk like the teacher wanted, right? So Izzy tells, my mom doesn't want me not to know my language, where I come from and everything. She says, you shouldn't lose that because that's something you should be proud of and everything. So Izzy is not buying the push for international Spanish that she's receiving from the teacher. She has resilience to resist that. And regardless of the labels, regardless of what we think of foreign language students, heritage language students, some students will internalize a deficit ideology and others will develop a multilingual ideology. So in an old study, we have Ophelia who says, I use colloquial. I want to make it more standard. Now I'm aware that I was poor in Spanish and need to improve it. I know that I'm limited to some parts of my language. She's internalizing the deficit entirely. Whereas Jorge says, Spanish is in our brain. We just have to polish it. So he's not buying the deficit. in my study, I talked about the person who said, I prefer not to say anything if it's going to be wrong. But I had another student, also a foreign language learner, not a heritage, who said, unless you're a native speaker of Spanish, you're not going to be able to speak perfect. I mean, we're still English speakers, you know, because I mean, you want to say it correctly, but I don't think you need to say it always correct. I think you can always get away with it or get along the idea in a basic way. Yeah, you want to say it correctly, but it'll come through repetition and going over more and more, or being among people that speak correctly all the time. So she is really, truly not buying into the deficit. She has the resilience to resist against the deficit of accuracy. Our pedagogies can help move students from negative ideologies to more positive ones. And this is a beautiful poem that I found in María Luisa's study by a Korean American student. So again, someone who is a heritage speaker, but not of Spanish, taking Spanish. And al principio esto me molestaba, que los latinos tenían un estereotipo de mí como asiático, pero después me di cuenta que esto era fantástico, porque podía hablar sin tratar de ser perfecto. Sin la presión de impresionar, por fin superé mis preocupaciones. Aprendí a dejar la aprensión y a hablar con imperfección. Of course, I'm still not fluent. Pero a través de esta clase avanzada, espero haber avanzado en dos cosas, mi conocimiento de la lengua española y el bienestar de la comunidad latina. Muchas gracias. A beautiful way of changing towards positive multilingual ideologies. I am going to skip because I don't want to go over time. It's just really beautiful studies that we have showing the power of what happens when we work with our students' ideologies. So if you build your students' linguistic confidence, they will want to keep learning Spanish and using Spanish, and they will be proud of who they are in all their languages. So let me finish with a brief mention of students need to feel they have a say over their learning. And this is not related to language teaching or to teaching Spanish in the US. This is purely a pedagogical point, but I think it's a very important one. It comes from John Marshall Reeve and the idea of engagement as agentive, not just being ready to take all the opportunities that the teacher provides, but being ready to enhance those opportunities by making suggestions, offering input, and communicating preferences. So agentic engagement is defined in a way that I find fascinating and really important. The degree to which students make their secret motivations public in class and known to teachers. Just think about it for a second. To what extent do you feel your students are willing to make their secret motivations public in the class to you and to the peers? And this is the research team doing this research. And let me give you examples of what it would look like. For example, a student who tells us, reading Shakespeare is nice, but I would prefer to watch the movie version. May we do that? Or a student who says, could we practice this language in a real setting and not just memorize note cards? Or a student who says, may we work with a partner and not alone? Or a student who says, could you show me how to do this? Could you give me an example? Could you have a little, could we have a little bit more time? They are making the suggestions to change their learning environment so that they can learn more engagedly and more actively. So how do we support this kind of student agentic engagement? We have to ask our students regularly, what are you interested in? What do you want to learn about? And we should always be thinking, what would my students say if someone asked them, what do you think? Your teacher is unresponsive or responsive to your opinions? Your teacher is indifferent or interested in how you feel? What would our students answer to those questions? So let me conclude with just the points that I raised. To engage our students, we should be asking ourselves constantly, when and how do I invite my students' lives and communicative repertoires into my classroom? How am I helping my students boost their linguistic confidence? What do I do to support a strong, vivid sense of multilingual success in each of them? How do I attend to my students' ideologies of language learning, nourishing positive ones, working with them to transform negative ones? And when and how do I invite my students' secret desires for learning into my classroom? So we must ask these questions also of our institutional structures of learning. How are our colleagues doing this and helping us do it in our own classrooms? What is our program articulation like, and does it allow these kinds of things? What are the textbooks like? What are the syllabi we create like? What are the tests and grades we create? How much engagement do we let come into our pedagogy through all of these domains of institutional structures of learning? And so I go back to the three messages that I want to give you with my talk, and I will finish with this. For students to want to engage affectively, behaviorally, cognitively, and agentively with Spanish, they need to feel that their learning connects to the rest of their lives. They need to feel proud of who they are in all their languages, and they need to feel they have a say over their learning. Thank you very much, and I would love to hear questions and comments from you. I'll stop sharing as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Lourdes. It's been fascinating. You've really engaged us all in your talk, in your explanation and presentation of this very complex topic. So thank you very much for your presentation, for preparing it so well. For touching on so many different aspects, which show the difficulty and the need to the difficulty of this topic, and the need to debate it and to reflect on it. So let me invite all our attendees to ask questions or make comments. You are invited to do so either through the chat in writing, or you may also ask the questions yourselves orally if you prefer. So would anybody like to start?
Can I ask,
Yeah.
Joseph, would you mind putting us all in small little boxes so that I don't see myself so large, and I can hear questions and comments from the audience? Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
So would anybody like to ask a first question or make a first comment? I was just going to I mean, I have so many thoughts and reflections and questions. I would just like to start by asking you, Lourdes, in relation to this experience that you mentioned, of this a learner who spoke Tex-Mex, the Tex-Mex variety. You mentioned her when you were discussing the language insecurity. Wouldn't it be the same? What she mentions, that sometimes she realizes that she said something which is not understood by the people she's talking to, and then she says, "Oh, that's Tex-Mex," and that strengthens her language insecurity. Wouldn't it be useful to tell her that this is really what happens to all native speakers of, in our case, Spanish, in different speakers of different varieties, and that sometimes we use words or even expressions or turns of phrase which speakers of other varieties don't understand or misunderstand, which is more just trickier or more dangerous even, because maybe making heritage language learners or foreign language learners aware of the fact that these situations also take place between native speakers of the language from different varieties making them aware of this might strengthen their security, or I don't know if that could be useful. I don't know.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea, but it leaves outside a very important fact, which is that there is a stigmatized variety and a privileged variety. And so me being from southern Spain, I can really relate to that. No one is going to convince me that when I use an expression or a word or a pronunciation from Andalusia, that some of my expat friends don't understand, no one is going to convince me that, oh, it's just what happens when you speak different languages or different varieties. I'm always going to know that they're stigmatizing my variety, and that my variety is looked down upon, right? That Southern Spanish within Spain is considered less prestigious than the rest of the Spanishes that we have in Spain. With the relationship between Mexican Spanish and Tex-Mex, for example, is exactly the same thing. So unless you equip the students with the critical awareness of the hierarchies, the linguistic hierarchies that exist, and the power and the stigmatization that they are a part of, then they're never going to be able to resist and counter that stigmatization and that linguistic insecurity. So linguistic insecurity is not an internal psychological phenomenon of individuals. Linguistic insecurity is a form of linguicism and violence that is structural. It comes from a society where the majority speakers decide their variety is better, and the minoritized speakers, racialized speakers, are told their variety is less good. Mm-hmm. So yes, politicizing and being very aware, critical language awareness, I think, is very much about politicizing things and making sure that the hierarchies and the ratio-linguistic ideologies are clear to students. But it is a good idea. I just think it won't work.
Thank you very much. So there's one question from the audience. Molly, you can go ahead. There's some.
Hi there, Lourdes. This was wonderful. I learned so much. I was nodding along. I was very excited. And you taught me a couple of really interesting things, such as native speakerism and the linguistic insecurity that we all bilinguals feel. And it occurs to me that that's something that we as professors should share with our students, right? Like they may think of us as being somehow so impressive and authoritative, and we all have felt it at one point or another. And I think that's wonderful. I have two questions for you, sort of how questions. So I loved the notion of having students share their secret desires. Was it? What was the word you used? They're saying, okay. So I would ask you, how do you do that? And then the other question I would have for you is, how do we deal with colleagues who have a very strong opinion about a sense of correct Spanish being the only possible way for us to teach our students?
Let me answer the second question first. It's very, very difficult. It's very difficult, obviously. And if it's not your colleague, but it's your boss, it's even worse. But there is an advantage that we have as teachers. When we walk into the classroom, it's us and our students. And so even when we have to make compromises and work with whatever our program, our textbook, our tests are giving us, we can still work with our students, both by designing things for them in our classroom and on the fly in the ways we respond to their contributions, their comments, or in the ways we highlight unfairness in things that are happening in the textbook or in the tests. So those things are within our control. And I think once you see it, you can never take it back. And so even if you have to be sad that your colleagues or your boss are constraining you, on the other hand, once you walk into your classroom, I think, a critically language aware teacher will at least do a lot for it within the constraints. The first question, I think the first question is pretty easy. I think a lot of teachers who are very, very good teachers do it all the time. So you stop and you say, wait, what would you like to do for homework next week? Would you prefer this or that? And we tend not to ask, we tend to plan our classes, right? Plan our things. And sometimes we're like on a roll with our great planning. if we can introduce a few points in a lesson plan where we say, oh, let's ask them. Or if we can reserve, 10 minutes every week or every other week for something that comes from the floor, something that comes from the students. Okay, we don't have anything planned for 10 minutes this week. Tell me what you want to do. Maybe it's, like María Luisa, in María Luisa's study, someone who says, I want to study the reggaeton that is happening in Salvador, and I want to analyze the lyrics. So then you do it, right? So it's very challenging for students to be able to tell you what they want to do. So they definitely need from the teacher the space and the question, what would you like to do? We have a little bit of empty space here. How would you want to spend it? And that can be done.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got María Luisa waiting to ask a question too. So you can go ahead, María Luisa.
Of course. Well, thank you, Lourdes. It was an amazing presentation, and I think that you cover so much ground. This labeling is so important. I see here in the audience 2 students from Mexico that are taking a course with me from La Universidad Autónoma de Baja California. And we have been talking about the impact of labeling students to design curriculum, to teacher practices, and also to students' identity. So I think that's really important. And on that regard, and connecting it with, Marta's comment and your idea of continuum of multilingualism, right? Mm-hmm. At which point we as teachers need to develop this sensibility to understand what is at stake for each one of our students when they learn a language or they decide to come to learn a language. And we know that it's very different from an L2 perspective than from a heritage perspective. And how it's just to add on to what you have said, is politicizing of the language learning process, where they have internalized, and how to make that part of, the classroom, especially in mixed classes, where everybody comes with a different expectation and with different affective relationship to the language.
Yeah, it's really a huge negotiation space, right? You have to negotiate so much. I think if you can teach some classes that are designed for heritage speakers, that's great, but not every program can do that because they may not have the numbers and the capacity to do it. So there has to be a space also for mixed classes. And I think that if you do it well, and if you are just always rooted in your particular students that you have, then I think they benefit from each other's presence in the class, from seeing their strengths and their weaknesses under different lies. Going back to Marta's comment, if you have not experienced linguicism on your native variety, for whatever reason, you're a speaker of mainstream English, or you're a speaker of Castilian Spanish or national Mexican well-educated Spanish. If you haven't experienced that kind of vulnerability with one of your languages, you're likely to have experienced it with some other language or with some other variety. And so if you haven't had a linguistic microaggression, which is linguicism, right? You may have had microaggressions for other parts of your identity. Exploring that in the classroom and making sure that everyone knows we all have felt the victim of a minoritizing gaze for different reasons at some point. Some of us continuously experience it, and I think the heritage speakers with their Spanish, they continuously experience it. Others don't have those experiences that often, but they can search in memory and find some of those experiences. So I think exploring that gives you the space to start cultivating this multilingual positive ideology, right? This idea of, we're all here learning Spanish. That means that by definition, we're all multilinguals in the making. right? And then work with that. But I recognize, and I mean, you're doing it. The people in this audience, you are the ones doing the Spanish teaching. You're the ones working with heritage speakers and with foreign language speakers. You're the ones seeing your classes be more and more diverse with more and more multilinguals for completely different backgrounds, right? So you are the ones who are developing the tools, the awareness, and the thinking about it. And I think the research shows it. I mean, I was going to say the cantidad de estudios, la cantidad de estudios que he visto preparando esta charla, estaba encantada e impresionada. Entonces, we do know that students appreciate every effort, and that it's both the foreign and the heritage language students who appreciate the efforts whenever we do something to push a happier notion of multilingualism. Yeah.
Gracias.
Thank you, María Luisa. I think there's Diego from Florida who wants to make a comment. I think it's Diego Pascual. Is it Diego Pascual? I don't know. He just says, soy Diego de Florida. Estamos haciendo un watch party en mi lab y os mandamos saludos y tenemos una pregunta para Lourdes. But I think you can ask the question yourselves, Diego or Diana. You there?
Oh, nice. Dios mío.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll read it then. En un momento, no, are you there?
He's just muted. He's just
okay.
There.
Buenas tardes. Gracias, Lourdes.
Ahí estáis. Bien. Hola.
Sí, básicamente teníamos la pregunta aquí en el lab. Cuando has hablado de los cursos de español para lengua de herencia y los cursos de español para L2, la pregunta era más sobre no estamos contribuyendo nosotros, aparte del problema de seguir discriminando las clases o el español como lengua de herencia en Estados Unidos por enseñar los dos de manera paralela, ¿verdad? En las clases de español como lengua de herencia le decimos, your Spanish is good enough, pero luego vamos a las clases de L2 y le decimos, but it's not good enough for you guys. To you guys, we're going to teach the real Spanish. Nuestra pregunta aquí es, ¿cuál es tu opinión al respecto? Y si piensas que hay alguna solución que podamos tomar. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti y al lab entero por estar aquí. Bueno, yo diría que es igualmente problemático hablar del español real, del español académico, del español apropiado, del español internacional a los estudiantes de L2, ¿no? A los foreign language students. Entonces, por eso digo que Critical Language Awareness necesita estar enseñado también. Si tenéis clases solo de L2, tienen que desarrollar esa misma Critical Language Awareness, porque lo que necesitan es desarrollar una capacidad comunicativa con hablantes de español en Estados Unidos y fuera de Estados Unidos, right? Y eso no significa español internacional, eso significa español diverso. The ability, the comfort of being fine with multiple Spanishes, right? We're not going to speak lots of different varieties of Spanish. We speak whatever varieties we manage to learn, either growing up or in the classroom. But we have to be okay listening and interacting with different varieties of Spanish and not lose it because suddenly I'm going to speak Andalusian or you're going to speak Spanglish or Tex-Mex, right? So I think the argument of, yeah, I think you're right to be critical of that problem if that problem is developing in programs. And, you know, oftentimes when I think of teachers in general, language teachers, I always recommend teachers do over your career or parallel, do both. Teach as a native speaking teacher and teach as a non-native speaking teacher. I've done it, right? I've taught Spanish and English. That just gives you such a strength of perspective because then you understand what it means to be the non-native speaker, to be the native speaker, and to be stigmatized or put into a box or a corner or a label that you don't like. So maybe that's also part of the issue that in a program, if teachers specialize in teaching the L2 students only or in teaching the heritage students only, they are free not to understand and travel the two contexts, the two situations, and then some of them will develop this idea of the real Spanish and the international Spanish for the L2 learners, and maybe the others are much more sensitized towards critical language awareness for the heritage learners. And so we create a silos, right? If that's what happens in programs.
Muchas gracias.
Any other questions?
I saw someone said in the chat, no sé, lo he leído antes. He comprado ya el libro que recomendaste. Yesenia ha dicho eso. That was part of my intention. To show lots of researches and resources, because it's wonderful that we have so many things, right? So, and they are in Spanish, they're in English, it's just wonderful. So there's a lot of richness that one can work with.
Would you say, Lourdes, that linguistic insecurity affects heritage language speakers more than foreign language speakers, or that it affects them differently? Can we make that distinction? Maybe does it affect heritage language speakers more emotionally? I'm just wondering. And foreign language learners more, let's say, intellectually, in the sense that maybe they judge their own knowledge of the language more harshly than they should. They think they know the language, they have a worse command of the language than they actually have, but it doesn't really affect them emotionally as it would heritage language learners. Maybe we can't make that distinction.
No, I think it's a good point. I'm trying to, in the field of TESOL or English language teaching, there's a long tradition of studying native speakerism. And native speakerism is very parallel to linguistic insecurity. It's creating linguistic insecurity in learners of English as a foreign language or a second language, right? So I think you would find a very similar linguistic insecurity in teachers of Spanish who are non-native speaking teachers of Spanish, who learned Spanish as a foreign language and now they're teachers of Spanish in their classroom. They probably have the same kind of intense emotional linguistic insecurity on and off when working with colleagues who are native speakers of Spanish themselves, working with heritage students where maybe the foreign language teacher, former foreign language student who is now a teacher, feels sometimes at a disadvantage culturally or in terms of fluency, in terms of native knowledge, right? So I think the labels are there to help, but when they become a problem, then we better just do away with them. I think how you learn a language and how you live your languages and what you do with your languages on a daily basis is what makes you connected to your languages and is what creates ideologies that are not just cognitive ideas, but they are emotional realities that you live with. So a teacher of Spanish who was a foreign language student may have developed a form of linguistic insecurity, native speakerism, that is similar to a heritage speaker of Spanish, because in both cases it's so intimately connected to their own identity. It's the experience, the life that you have with your language that creates that linguistic insecurity, and the context, the societal context and the structure.
Thank you. So we have another question from Diego's lab in Florida, but let me first tell you that there's somebody, Mary Ramirez, asks whether you could show the title of the book again.
Which book? Which one?
I think is it María Luisa's book?
Is it? Yeah,
I think it's I think
know.
she's referring to Yesenia's comment that I already purchased a book you recommended. Oh, I don't know. Yeah, it's a book. I don't know Which book are you referring to, Mary? Well, while she writes it, maybe we can invite the people in the lab in Florida to ask their question.
Yes, one of my wonderful students has a question, so
Yeah. So first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to ask if you touched briefly on building linguistic confidence and the importance of this in the classroom. So I was curious, what are some of like the popular methods for building linguistic confidence, and does this differ a lot between heritage learners and foreign language learners?
I think critical language awareness is the best method we have. It's not a method, but it's an approach, right? The best approach we have to building confidence. So when you send your students to the community to elicit words, when you show Pau as a picture, elicit all the different words, and they're not good or bad, they're just lots of words for the same concept, right? Or when you send your students out to take photos of the linguistic landscape, and then you bring them back to class, and then you analyze, and then you see that not everything is correct in either Spanish or English, and that not everything is just a parallel translation of each other in the signs and the photos. All of these things build linguistic confidence. Yeah, the responses that we give when we correct errors, we could say something like, no, we don't say it that way. I always get puzzled if I hear that correction, because I think, who is we? I say it that way. I say it that way and I'm fine. And you understood what I said, right? So it's a little bit radical because, you know, with students, they're not going to answer like that to us. But if we see things happening where one person is stigmatizing another person's language, we can call it out. And doing all these things in the classroom, bringing in authentic materials, bringing in non-native Spanish by foreign language learners who speak Spanish, right? All of these things create that sense of linguistic confidence. I think it was the study by Josh Prada and Diego, and I forget the third author, comparing the experiences of heritage speakers inside the classroom that is mixed and in the heritage language only classroom. Some of the heritage students said, when our teacher is a heritage speaker teacher, she hears something we say, and if she doesn't know it, she asks like, oh, how interesting, what is that? What does it mean? Oh, what's the word? And she's curious and she wants to learn it too, right? And she shows this interest instead of being like, oh, that's not real Spanish, or that's not international Spanish. So learning to do these things, even if you're not a heritage speaker teaching Spanish, if you're an English speaker who learned Spanish and now is teaching it, learning to react in these ways is what can teach linguistic confidence to our students. But we have to be confident ourselves first in our own language before we can create that comfort in our students as well.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think there's another question by Molly. You're in mute. You're in mute, Molly.
You're right. Sorry. Just dovetailing on what Lourdes just said, collaborative knowledge production in the classroom can be really powerful, like word clouds, right? Just discuss like, how would you describe this character in a novel or in a movie, right? And I'm always amazed at heritage speakers, how they use, you could do this even in an L2 classroom as well, but heritage speakers always share such different words that each other doesn't understand, right? And so they learn from each other's Spanish, and I learned from them as well. I thought what you said was really powerful about those of us who are non-native speakers who teach Spanish, and instilling linguistic confidence is not only like important for people in general to feel good about their language, but it's also really important to the survival of our profession. because we're running out of language teachers in this country. I mean, if you follow ACTFL and the numbers that you see, we're running out of language teachers. And if teachers don't, and if we don't have language teachers at the high school level, we're going to have problems at the college level, right? So, I mean, we really need to be encouraging people and affirming their second language skills, so that we can encourage more people to become teachers, basically.
Right. I mean, we need both. Also, we need more heritage speakers who take up Spanish and then love the profession of teaching it and become teachers of Spanish as heritage speakers, and they feel like they can do that kind of a life call and have that job. We need both, right?
Oh, I would love that, but most of them tell me they don't want to do that because it pays too little.
Well, yeah, that's very true of all teaching, all teaching in the United States. I want to read a quote that I didn't include in the PowerPoint because I was eliminating things. I knew it was going to be too long, but I had a few things from teachers, and I want to read this quote because it comes from my own personal data. Long ago, a teacher of mine wrote it in a class for me and gave me permission to show it and use it. And it shows the huge amount of linguistic insecurity that an English speaker teacher of Spanish can feel, right? A foreign language. I learned it as a foreign language. Now I'm teaching it and I'm the teacher, I'm the authority. So this is just a quote by this person who says, "While I am not a native Spanish speaker, I have a fairly decent, authentic Spanish accent. However, I have heard Spanish speakers who speak with thick American, especially Southern accents. I am not questioning their abilities as a teacher, but I would be curious to know if students who have native Spanish speakers or native English speakers for ESL, so she's also making the comparison of non-native speaking English teachers of English, right? If students who have native Spanish speakers acquire a native-like accent." And then she sort of like re-explains. My question is, are the students I teach at a disadvantage for obtaining a native-like accent because their teacher is not a native? Will they speak like I speak? So this person is like worried that she doesn't have the right pronunciation because she's an English speaker teaching Spanish. She doesn't have the right pronunciation to serve their students well, and that the students are going to end up with a thick accent, English accented Spanish, because she is the teacher, right? And then she also has the ideology that in the South, it's an even worse English accent on the Spanish. So she was in Atlanta. So it's like such a complicated layering of linguistic deficit and linguistic insecurity over linguistic insecurity. This is an L2 Spanish teacher, a teacher who learned Spanish as an L2 or a foreign language. This is a deep insecurity. I read this as a deep insecurity because, it undermines your own sense of legitimacy as a teacher, right? Am I teaching Spanish, and will my students they speak like me, have my accent? And that's the worry.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lourdes, because I think, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think this question of linguistic insecurity has normally been dealt with, whenever it's been dealt with, from the point of view of the learners, but not so much from the point of view of the teachers. And it's so important for all the reasons that you are all touching on, that I think it's fascinating that both sides are addressed regarding this issue. So María Luisa is here with her hand raised.
Yeah,
So,
just to build on this topic of teacher training, how to build that pipeline, how to strengthen the body of bilingual teachers at all levels, because we know that we struggle at higher education, but bilingual education is also suffering deeply when most the Latino population, it's so big at the K through 12. So, and what is happening to the teaching programs? That, you know, what are the frameworks? Who designs those? Because it seems like there's an urgent need to change the paradigms under which we learn how to teach. So I don't know what do you see coming or in the future, or where can we, you know, contribute to this pipeline and curriculum development for teachers?
Yeah, well, I think you are the experts. I mean, honestly, I think there are many programs at in universities, in schools of education, or in arts and science colleges. There are many programs that are designed to train teachers of languages and teachers of Spanish, right? So I don't know what the state of the art is in terms of how well these different professional programs are communicate. Is there something at ACFL or MLA or AAAL where there's an opportunity for people who have, say, very successful master's programs that produce teachers who then become directors of programs in high schools, or BAs where people major in Spanish and then they get a license to teach and they go back to their schools to teach Spanish. I don't know if the profession is making concerted efforts to address the pipelines. But I mean, we are in a country where all of that is very bleak, right? There are few people studying foreign languages of any kind, world languages, US languages, immigrant languages in our schools. And there are, in the Latinx Spanish-speaking community, there are many people who don't make it out of high school or into college or out of college, right? So the pipeline, the weakening of the pipeline is happening at multiple levels all the time at different points of the pipeline. So I'm not surprised that in the end, the workforce of bilingual teachers of Spanish is not very strong. But this is systemic and structural, so it would require very concerted efforts by collaborative groups across institutions, and that's tricky too, because, you know, institutions also compete for the same students, right?
Thank you, Lourdes.
Yeah.
Well, to finish with a positive note, at least we have a chance to hold these conversations, to hold these events with brilliant speakers like Lourdes. Thank you so much, Lourdes. You've given us so much food for thought and so many valuable reflections. And thank you, María Luisa, for again, once more, proposing this really valuable and really interesting event for the Observatorio. So I think we can stop here, but really I think we should have another, not just another, but many more sessions on this topic and related topics of not just engagement, but all the other issues and aspects that Lourdes has touched on in her talk today. Don't you think? Okay, so thank you very much to everybody for joining us today, and hope
Thank you.
we'll see you again soon, hopefully.
Thank you very much to everyone for coming. Thank you so much.